Very excited for tonight's presentation because I saw Betty give this presentation, when was it? Back in February of this past year, and it was great. And I asked her at that point, can you come and give it here? And I know since then she's done even more research, tremendous amount of research. And so I really am looking forward to it because I know I'm going to learn a lot tonight. And so I appreciate that. Most of you may be familiar with Betty. She is a Montclair resident. She's a Montclair, that's why I said maybe at the last minute. Montclair resident, former teacher, and I think she totally deserves the title of historian after her work on this. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Betty. Oh, and please take one of these if you haven't taken it.
Thank you, Jane. And I owe Jane a debt of gratitude for her help and just allowing me to come here at any time to do the research that I needed to do on this particular project. And I also want to thank the Montclair Public Library, Chelsea Dodd and the staff there were very helpful in helping me to pull together all of the information that I needed in order to make this presentation. The talk that I did in February is very different from this because I only talked about the YWCA. And Jane, I don't know, do you know Anne-Marie?
Yes.
Okay, so you know Anne-Marie was the former, thank you, Anne-Marie. You know, this may be very special to you as being the former director at the YWCA. So here's what's happening, and here's where I'm going to start. I've titled this talk, and I had a lot of difficulty with trying to figure out what kind of title should be put on this kind of presentation. So I call it the guts, glory, and the tragedy of success against the odds. In a way, I'm kind of taking part of Bob Herbert's documentary that he did about Against the Odds, the struggle for the black middle class. This is an intimate and intriguing portrait of the Hooe family. You know, most of you, and I've spoken to Carol about this as well, when you talk about the YWCA, we always talk about Hortense, right? Mm-hmm. And so, and rightfully so, because Hortense was, she really characterized and lived the philosophy of the YWCA. Now, I know this picture is very bad, but it's an old picture. The picture is about the picture is 25 years old this year. And this is at the installation luncheon for the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, where Hortense was my sponsor. And as you can tell by the look on her face, it's a very proud moment for her. And I indeed felt very special that she had selected me as a person that she wanted to sponsor to be a part of the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. Hortense's whole personality was about uplifting the race. She would say this to us, right? A lot of my St. Mark's Church members are here tonight, so they may nod their heads a lot when I say things. And if I use the word our or us, I'm referring to St. Mark's, okay? So for 3 years, through Hortense's urging, I served on the board of the YWCA under Anne-Marie. It was always hard to say no to Hortense. At this time, she began to share information with me about how the Y was organized, and she talked about those 17 women from Union Baptist and St. Mark's who came together to organize the Y because there was a tremendous, at the time, there was a growing and tremendous need in the township. What I really want to establish at the outset, since there's so many of you who are here who are native Montclairians, Montclairites. I want you to know how I feel that Montclair is, how I have felt that Montclair is a very proud community, and I'm really serious about that. And many of the African Americans I've met talk about how many generations of their families have lived here and who was the first to do this or that. The reputation of the people in this town, as I learned after moving here in 1990, was wrapped up in a strong sense of community and belonging. On the outside, I learned that others viewed Montclair and its residents as in a special way as well. It means something when you tell people you're either from Montclair or you live in Montclair. Reared and educated in North Carolina, the child of sharecroppers from Washington, Georgia, I too am proud to say I live in Montclair. However, my daughter and my uncle's son and daughter claim Montclair as their hometown. And rightfully so, this is where they grew up. But quite frankly, I want to be upfront with you and tell you that some stuff that I found, I just don't like to remember. And looking back in history sometimes can be very tough. So be prepared. On December 4th, 1940, if you saw my presentation in February, this slide would be very familiar to you. This is at 52 North Willow Street, and it's where the fatality occurred in this driveway. Alice fell to her death, and she was found in the driveway by a neighbor who called the ambulance, and she was taken to Mountainside Hospital. And so I really didn't understand why would she do such a thing. She was 65 years old, and I discovered that the home did not belong to her. The home belonged to an Adolf Owitter, a widowed Russian-born Locks outfitter, in which years earlier he had shared this home with his wife Bessie and 3 daughters, Rose, Lily, and Amelia. The daughters were not occupants at the time, and perhaps Alice was renting a room. Again, I ask, why? Mrs. Foster's funeral was held at St. Mark's United Methodist Church. At the time, it was St. Mark's Episcopal Methodist Church. And the Reverend J.C. Love of Union Baptist Church officiated. It is believed that Union Baptist may have been her family church, but she had come to St. Mark's through her marriage to Walter Foster. There were several expressions of sorrow for the loss to the community published in the December 10th, 1940 issue of the Montclair Times. One letter was written by Annette C. Goodell. She was the wife of Edwin B. Goodell. You will hear me call his name several times during this presentation. She was also chairman of the advisory board from 1923 to 1929 of the YWCA for colored women. You know, there was a management group of white women who met with the board for the Y. So among other things, she mentioned in this article that she wrote for the Montclair Times how Alice's parents provided jobs not only for their children, but others in the community, how she had been an outstanding student at Montclair High School and had served the YWCA cheerfully and unselfishly. She closed her comments with this abbreviated quote from Revelations chapter 14, verse 13. They may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them. Yes, I wanted to go backwards in time and find the labors and works of her family in this town. This is the town seal, and it tells the history of Montclair in brief. And Anyone want to take a stab at it? Give me a 1-minute history of Montclair from this seal? Okay, I'll do it. The original people of this territory were the Lenape Indians, represented here. Lenape. No. Lenape. Okay, thank you. Lenape Indians, represented by this seal, and the area was colonized by the Cranes, represented here. As you can see, I'm a little nervous, and the Spears. The Cranes were of English origin, and the Spears of Dutch origin. And so they purchased this area of land in an area called Watchung. Anyone knows what Watchung means? It means, and I'm really happy in these times of great weather events, it means sheltered by mountains. So I love it. Okay, so I have to skip over nearly 400 years of history, and I'm sorry, Jane, for doing that, but I need to fast forward and talk about the Puritan Visionaries who settled in this area. Montclair at one time was called West Bloomfield, and it broke with the greater part, which was Bloomfield. And it was believed, I read on several occasions, that it's believed that the break came from a bond issued for a railroad to come from Newark through Bloomfield to West Bloomfield. So the Puritans, I labeled them as, they were written about as the progressives in the area. So the train arrived at Lackawanna. They won, of course, and the train arrived at Lackawanna in 1856. The name changed to Montclair in 1860, and Montclair seceded and incorporated as a township on April 15, 1868. So what I also needed to know about Montclair prior to the Hooe's coming here was who was here first. So I lived around the corner from this house for 7 years, never visited it, probably looked at it every now and again. But during this research project, I found that the house belonged to a former slave of the Cranes. His name was James Howe, and he was manumitted by Nathaniel Crane. So he was here. Now, it's interesting as I went through the literature about the history of Montclair, how certain people remembered certain things. And Philip Doremus's book, I really love that book, Reminiscences of Montclair, because he writes so jovially. You know, there's something very refreshing about the way that he was writing about what he remembered and loved about Montclair. And the one thing that he adored was James Howe telling stories about his ancestors, the Cranes, for whom he was a slave. However, Edwin Goodell, who wrote the book Montclair, The Evolution of a Suburban Town, he had a copy of Nathaniel Crane's will, and he shared with his readers, quote, "Among other things in his will, he left 6 acres to James Howe, a colored man, late a slave, whom he manumitted." This book was written in 1934. Please keep that in mind. "This little settlement," he continues, "is destined to remain, in part at least, in the possession of James Howe, his heirs and assigns, much longer than some of the white people who are about to come to this hillside will desire, for it occupies one of the most eligible sites in town." According to Elizabeth Shepard, the 1870 census was the first census conducted after Montclair was incorporated. At that time, there were only 36 African Americans in Montclair, most of whom were born in New Jersey, with only a few born in Virginia, North Carolina, and Louisiana. 4 families had their own homes, and the remaining were live-in laborers and servants. What was it like to live in such a vibrant Puritan culture, you might ask? Well, Montclair's Puritan origins did not hide the fact that there was a clear distinction between a ruling class and a servant class. A clear premise was established in the book, A Goodly Heritage, Montclair Commemorative History, 1664 to 1964, in a section titled The First Houses. The authors wrote, "We are apt to think of a culture purely in terms of its more substantial members. In early days, class distinctions were definite, and there was little stepping over the boundaries. There were masters and there were servants."
Where was that house?
That house is at 369, I'm sorry, you can't see it there. It's 369 Claremont Avenue. 360, it's a little gray house right there. You probably drive by it every time you go.
What's the cross street it's near?
Upper Mountain Avenue. Okay, if you go down Upper Mountain and you make a left turn, it's the second house on the right. Uh-huh. Yep, 369. So here's another person that was here, and according to Dr. Samuel Watkins, who is a self-proclaimed first dentist in Montclair, he called her Aunt Polly. That's how she was popularly known in town. And this house was located at the corner of, right around the corner here, at the corner of Plymouth and Harrison Avenue. It was demolished around 1890, and this picture was taken by Randall Spaulding. Keep that name in mind because I'll mention him again. Photography was just one of the things that he loved. In Elizabeth Shepard's document, An Evolution of a Community, there are several individuals listed as she establishes a profile of the residents. African American men were employed as farm hands, laborers, hostlers, servants, teamsters, and cooks, and the women were employed as servants. One man, Charles Ennis from Massachusetts, was a wig maker. 12 families had their own homes. Some houses may have been multifamily structures since more than one family were living in them. The remaining African Americans were live-in servants and farm hands. And Elizabeth shows that she got her research from the U.S. Census from 1860 to 1880. In my research, I found that the Hooes looked for and actively sought their way out of the servant class. So what did they find, the Hooes, when they arrived? This little apple tree is around the corner from my house. And what we have to describe, and this is a direct quote, what we have to describe is the transformation of a region of farmers and country storekeepers into a populous residential town for city people, according to Edwin Goodell in his book, Montclair, The Evolution of a Suburban Town. The Hooe family was right at the beginning of the transformation. Now, I didn't just take this picture because of this crab tree because it was cute, but I took this picture because it represented a very vibrant industry here in Montclair, wherein I understand there was apple cider and vinegar making that was shipped all across the country, made right here in Montclair. And New Jersey is particularly a good place for growing apples. Something else I learned. Circa, I really, based on the information that I have, I could take that word circa off, 1874 to 1880, because I really do believe that the Hooes arrived here in 1874. So Charles Hooe and his wife Sarah arrived in Montclair with their 3 boys. And around this time was known as the beginning of the first Great Migration, which would have been after the Emancipation Proclamation. And in 1870, many African Americans were fleeing the oppressive South and moving north. The Civil War was over. When Charles married Sarah in Virginia in 1870, he was 21 and she 17. 3 years later, Sarah had given birth to 3 boys, and something inspired them to leave Virginia. Perhaps it was the stronghold of the Confederacy, but they headed up north for Montclair, and they arrived here around 1874. Why did they come to Montclair? Well, in his book, The History of Montclair, published in 1894, Henry Whitmore may offer a clue as he describes how the colored population came to Montclair. The section in his book is entitled, "The Colored Population and Their Churches." I will read the first paragraph because I think it's important to understand Whitmore's interpretation and his explanation. Quote, "The influx of the colored people in Montclair began about 1870, the total colored population of the township at the time being 36, and was the result of an effort to solve the servant question. A prominent citizen of Montclair brought from Loudoun County, Virginia, 2 or 3 servants on trial. They proved satisfactory, and others, learning that better wages could be obtained at the North, soon followed. And as was the custom, they took the names of their masters. All became free under the proclamation of President Lincoln. As a class, they are quiet, industrious, and well-behaved. They retain many of their old-time customs, but readily adapt themselves to the new conditions of affairs. The larger proportion of them are house servants, yet some have already acquired considerable property. They are a church-going people and are active in advancing the cause of religion and have made rapid progress in their churches." End of quote. The 2 churches that he was referring to were St. Mark's and Union Baptist. But now, at 25 and Sarah at 21, when they arrive in Montclair, the earliest employment information I could find was from the 1880 census, listing his occupation as a gardener. His neighbors were listed as laborers, sextons, painters, carpenters, and a confectioner. All of the women were listed as keeping house. As I build a narrative around how the Hooe family survived those first years, I can only imagine that he became good friends with his neighbors and hired himself out to do any number of jobs. And I might add that his neighbors, the neighborhoods, were not either all black or all white. They were pretty mixed. But it appears their first 6 years was a struggle trying to get settled and find permanency. The 1878 Montclair tax book listed them as tenants living on the southeast corner of Willow Street. In 1880 and 1881, they were listed as tenants on the south side of Bloomfield Avenue in the adjacent frame. I don't know what that means in terms of a living space. But the following 2 years at 10 Morris Brick, which is yet another confusing description of their living quarters. So each year's tax book listing a tax assessed to all residents was assessed to all residents in Montclair. And I don't know that much about poll taxes, but I do know that as an African American, we know that poll taxes prevented us from voting. And so in Montclair, in the tax books, starting with 1878 to 1872, Charles Hooe was assessed a $4 poll tax. Everyone else was assessed a $1 poll tax. Now, the article over there was, I called Jane frantic one day and said, Jane, what do you know about poll taxes in Montclair? And so I found this article on the database of the New York Times, and it describes how New Jersey was having a hard time because all municipalities were not collecting their poll taxes. But that the communities that collected poll taxes, that were successful in collecting those poll taxes, it was a part of their regular tax bill. So if you look at the 1878 tax record book, you'll see that. There's a column for poll taxes and a column for all of the other taxes that were collected by the township. I was just absolutely fascinated to find Charles Hooe's name listed every year. Just goes to show you, right? He was establishing himself and his family here pretty quickly. So I don't have pictures of the Hooe family, so if any of you know the artist Carol Walker, she silhouettes. So I'm taking from her silhouettes as a representation of the people that I want you to know. So by 1880, they've been here, they've struggled, they've been at several locations for a living space. And so the three oldest sons were born in Virginia, and you see here a picture of Alice. This is Alice Hooe at the time. This is the only picture of the family that I have, and no, it's not. I'll show you another one later. But the other children that were listed in the 1880 census were her brother Edward, Rosher, he's often referred to, and Grace. Evangeline was not listed in the 1880 census because she was not yet born. She was born 2 weeks later the census was done June 21st, 1880, and Evangeline was born on July 4th, 1880.
How did Alice come about?
Who's Alice?
So Alice is the first child of Charles and Sarah to be born in Montclair. Who are you? These three sons, Clifford, Charles, and William, were born in Virginia. Alice is the first to be born in Montclair.
Seven children.
By now, 7 children. Okay. So one of the other things that, as a former teacher, that I am interested in is, how job titles are listed. And one of the things that the 1880 census wanted to do was to make a clear distinction between who was a housekeeper and who was keeping house. A housekeeper, as you would imagine, would be someone working to get paid. Keeping house would be that you're doing work for yourself. So on the page where Sarah is listed, all of the women are keeping house. I only saw one domestic servant on the page where they were listed. So I am going to assume that Montclair is very fastidious in all that was happening around here, and that they were doing the census correctly and according to the instructions that were handed down to them as enumerators. they were given specific instructions on what they were to look for. So as you can see, the African American population in 1880, or the population in general, is growing. And I don't think I clearly established this earlier on in the slides. One of the things that the Puritan Visionaries were really clear about was they wanted to develop Montclair, and they wanted to attract the businessmen from New York. They wanted to attract Jersey City people. They wanted people to come into this township and develop it. So you can see a part, and so you can see that the population is growing. A part of the work that they are doing is working, right? So we are now at 5,000, and the African American population is up to 180. Now, this information I got from Elizabeth Shepard in a document that she did called An Evolution of a Community. And by 1885, there were 280 of us in town. So by 1880, also what happened? People said, there are enough of us in town so that we can have our own church. And so St. Mark's people who had previously been meeting, because that was a part of the Methodist tradition, you would have meeting ministries in your home. They were called class meetings. And so they met in their homes prior to them getting this church, which belonged to the white Methodists, but they built their own brand new beautiful church over on North Fullerton. And so this church was sold to St. Mark's. It wasn't given to St. Mark's. It was sold to St. Mark's, and they were there as supply pastors to help St. Mark's gain its footing for a number of years. This minister that I'm showing here is not the minister that was there from 1880. Now, I have this comparison picture over here because that's our parsonage from 1885. It's still there, and there's a marker that's there that designates it. The town put a marker there that designates it, and they spelled Episcopal correctly, Liz. So Liz and I were walking by there. Liz noticed that Episcopal was spelled wrong. And so I went to Richard Sharoon at the town planner's office, and he graciously got it covered. But this is that ugly apartment building where the church, where this church used to be, but that it burned down some years ago. So again, we go back to the popular literature that was written at the time. In Dr. Samuel Watkins' book, as he was talking about the growth of the churches in Montclair, he mentioned that he just skips over St. Mark's, and he goes directly to First United Methodist over on Fullerton Street. But Ed Goodell, we can depend on him, in his book, he takes the reader on a virtual walking tour of the neighborhood, pointing out its growth, and made this observation about the Methodist Church. Quote, "A little further up the street and still on the right-hand side stands the Methodist parsonage. And on the opposite side of the street and nearly at the top of the rise is the Methodist meeting house. No one, I presume, would have thought of calling it a church in those days. Still standing and still Methodist and used by a good class of our colored population." At the time this book was written, members of, which was 1934, please keep that in mind, members of St. Mark's included doctors, lawyers, musicians, teachers, insurance salesmen, women and men who worked in service, as they like to call it, which is really housekeeping, and also community leaders. I later learned from members, some of them in this room tonight, that it was known as the church for the upper class African Americans, and it was the church where Alice's future husband was a member and superintendent of Sunday school. She would later join. So as you can see, there's quite a distinction between the characterization of the people and how they were actually living.
Okay, Betty, just so we have one question. St. Mark's, this we're looking at is Bloomfield Avenue, though, not your Elm Street church.
No, that's
Okay,
much later.
This is Bloomfield Avenue?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So I was getting confused.
Mm-hmm. So about from 1880 at about 1882 to 1887, Charles moved his family to Charles Street. Now, you go down, you all know where Charles Street is, right? Yes. Down Harrison Avenue. So they were tenants there, and they lived there for about 5 years. Their landlord was named John Kelly, and by the time he moved here, he was now being assessed a $1 poll tax. So Charles, at this particular point, he's continuing his work as a gardener, and what I imagine is that Charles is a very neighborly guy, and he's probably getting a lot of different jobs doing different things other than what is just listed in the census. So now we're looking at the family from 1883 to 1890, but I'm going to parse it out a little bit. So you see another child is born, little Walter. Now little Walter has been shaded in gray because he was born in 1883, but he also died in 1883. But what I want to say about this period in Montclair, the New York business people, the artists and entrepreneurs were coming to Montclair, and 1886 was particularly a prosperous period. According to Ed Goodell, more homes were built and opportunities for the working class were opening up. I'm thinking all of the school-aged children, which would be Alice, and I'm hoping that some of her brothers, Alice, Edward, and maybe Grace and Evangeline, I'm hoping that they would have been in school by then. And I have more to say about that. From all accounts, they were indeed an industrious family, and all census records, from what I could find, indicated that they had reading, writing, and speaking literacy, including their parents. Obviously, except for Evangeline, Sadie, and Philip. They were too young at the time. So in 1887, this is a particular interesting point because Charles adds another job to his resume. There was a dispute between the First Presbyterians and some of their parishioners. Ed Goodell, in his book, he refused to disclose the nature of the dispute. So a group of them petitioned the Newark Presby to approve another church. The approval was granted, and the new church was called Trinity Presbyterian Church and was built at Church Street and Valley Road. This picture is out of Whitmore's book, and I tried to lighten it up using PowerPoint, because if you go to Church Street and Valley Road right now, you won't see anything that looks like this church. So Trinity opened for public worship on May 29th, 1887, and was listed in the 1893 city directory, 1893 city directory as a free church. Now, as an African American, the first thing I'm going to think of as a free church would be that here's a church that is for freedom, is for anti-slavery, is for anti-lynchings, is against the Ku Klux Klans. But I found this to be humorous when I found out what it really meant. I learned that it was all about whether or not you had to pay for a pew. Did you know that that was the tradition? It was a Puritan tradition. You had to pay, or you paid for your pew seat. So I think I kind of got a different understanding about our churches and how some people claim their seats. You could literally claim your seat. So they hired a minister from Yale, and I have to add at this point, and I didn't know where to add it in my talk, I have to add at this point, a lot of Montclair original leaders were Yale graduates. So this minister that was hired for Trinity Presbyterian Church, they appointed Charles Sr. as their sexton. Now, if you, looking again at job descriptions, what a sexton does and what a janitor does are two different things, right? So a janitor comes in at a particular time and cleans, while a sexton is literally responsible for the building, the maintenance and keeping of the building. So this was the job that Charles Sr. Was hired to do. And one of the things I learned about the Hooe family, they held several jobs at the same time. As I said, he worked here for about 7 years. It's important for me to make this point right now that among the leaders of this church were the likes of Dr. John C. Love. Do any of you know about him? Of course, his house is right next door and a part of the whole history center.
That's Clark. Love
Clark.
is a different guy.
Oh, okay. I thought that was Dr. Love's house. Okay.
Those
So,
houses where the library is now.
oh, okay. Philip Doremus, another person who defected and went from the First Presbyterian and went here to Trinity. Edwin and Annette Goodell. These are just a few of the names. I named these individuals specifically because of their relationship with the Hooe family, and their names will come up, good or bad, on other occasions as we go through this information. I think also it's important to know, and it's interesting to me, that after 25 years of this church, the Trinity and First Presbyterian, whatever issue they had, the dispute was, they resolved it and closed the church. Isn't that interesting? So now when you look in the Montclair City Directory and you look for Charles Hooe, what do you see as his job titles? Around 1892, he is now listed as the sexton for Trinity, and he's also a carpet layer. So with the growing African-American population, and we have St. Mark's United Methodist Church, what else happened? We have another church. So there were disruptors in St. Mark's who felt like they wanted to have their own Baptist church, and so they left and formed Union Baptist Church. And so I always include Reverend Love's picture here because from what I read, I didn't know him, but from what I read about him, he was a formidable character. He was the minister of this church for 46 years, and he was the reason that that church is built. And the foundation that they said, what is written about him is that he always preached self-sufficiency, home ownership, spending wisely, and saving a lot. So I thought that was a pretty good legacy to bring about. So here is 24 Orange Road in 1888. The Hooes make another move. And so this little house right here is 24 Orange Road, and where the Hooes lived for about the next 7 years. And they were renting from a hardware store owner that it's Fence Laft. I may not be pronouncing it correctly, but that's who owned the house. But I'm going to mention that this name, and it'll come up again, a young Justin Roger Fitzroy also lived near this house. And we'll learn more about him as I go along in this presentation. So, 1890 to 1899, the Hooe family enters a turning point. You can see the population is steadily growing in Montclair, and so is the budget. So now we're looking at the population data that's in Whitmore's book for 1894 of the African American community, and it's tripled, right? We're now at 1,600. So I just wanted to show how once they moved in that house at 24 Orange Road, it gave them the freedom to do a lot of other things. And as you can see here they are listed. Charles Hooe is listed carpet layer, sexton for Trinity Presbyterian. Clifford Hooe is listed news dealer, 449 Bloomfield Avenue, and his home is 24 Orange Road. And William Hooe is a news dealer at 449 Bloomfield Avenue, and his home is at 24 Orange Road. And over here, we look at who are the news dealers, and I liken news dealer at the time to what a news store is today. So if you look down here, there are, here it is, 3 news dealers in Montclair, and the Hooe brothers are included as one of them, 1892. So 1892 is also another turning point for this family because they literally integrated the neighborhood and they bought this house right here. And that's 19 Maple Place. You know where Maple Place is? It's by the corner of where the gelati shop is. On one side it says Maple Place, on the other side it says Maple Plaza, but it's a very short street and it ends at Portland Place. So the Hooes bought this house from a man named Henry Yorst, and Henry was an architect, and he was also the Justice of the Peace, and he was also a notary public, okay? So his next door neighbor was a guy named McGurk, William McGurk. He was an Irishman. Now, my point in stating everybody's ethnicity is to point out to you that this neighborhood and this township was a community of immigrants. And when I say Irishman, I'm saying that the census record said born in, father and mother born, okay? So, and it all lists either Irish, Scottish, whatever, okay? So I'll be saying that throughout the presentation. So William McGurk was an Irishman and he was a gardener. And in this house here was owned by a man named John Johnson, who was a Swedish machinist. And number 25 here was owned by a man named Murdoch Robinson, who was a Scottish janitor. And across the street here was an Englishman known as Frederick Turner, and his job title was house decorator. Now, I'll go out on a limb and say that means interior decorator today, right? Or is it still house decorator, Wanda? No. and so this house, number 24 here, was owned by a gentleman who was an Italian tailor. His name was Pasquale Palladino. Now, you would have thought that Palladino and the Hooes were in competition for who could have more children. Because, as you saw, the Hooes, there were 8, and Palladino had 8 children. So each of these households, although I didn't list them, there were at least 3 or 4 children in each of the households. So can you imagine what playtime was like, right? So now, the Hooeys are homeowners. Their two oldest sons own a business. And so Sarah is still keeping house, right? And Alice is in school, probably getting ready to graduate pretty soon. And her other siblings are right behind her. So in the email that Jane sent out, one of the things that she pointed out in that notice was that this little box here was the first business of the Hooe brothers. That little box was their newspaper business. But, that little box, but I had a question in the back of my mind, and I kept thinking, how the heck could this little box be the only part of the business? Because I was fantasizing, you know, the old movies with the young men standing on the corner screaming, extra, extra, read all about it. You know, that was the kind of scenario that I had in my mind about the newspaper business for the Hooe brothers. So I spent time at the Mount Hebron Cemetery and got to know Bill McElroy pretty good. And he's a great guy. And I gave him a whole list of things that I was looking for. And Bill likes to get things off his desk quickly. And so he went to grab the Hooe Cemetery folder because they had bought a plot at Mount Hebron Cemetery. And what fell out was an article that I want to show you, or a picture that was, it just blew me away because it confirmed, or at least it settled my mind on how in the world could these young men run a business out of this. This was the newspaper article that fell out of the folder, and what it shows here is, right here is a store. And the previous general manager at the Mount Hebron Cemetery had clipped this, obviously had clipped this article from March 1943. It was celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Montclair Savings Bank. And he had written a note at the top, newspaper and tobacco store of Hooe family. It made sense to me after I saw that picture. All of the information that I was reading, but I was looking for authentic research, and I hadn't found it until I found this picture. So this celebrating 50 years in 1943 of the Montclair Savings Bank means that something had to happen because they built this structure next to that Morris building, right? Okay, so moving right along. So this was my exciting find. And so moving right along, in 1894, a number of things happened in the Hooe family. The first thing that happens is, once Bill helped me to learn why there, you know, what was the cause of death for a number of the Hooe family members. The first thing I learned was about Clifford, who, remember, they had just started the business in 1892. And so, and Clifford, I forgot to mention this, and his father purchased the home at Maple Place. Remember here? Clifford and his father purchased that home for $3,300. They paid cash, and they paid cash to Ed Goodell, who was the master of chancery at the time, or that was the phrase they used, meaning clerk of court, right? And so they paid cash for this house, and they had the business, and for grief to strike this family in 1894, and for them to lose Clifford, I am sure it was devastating because it just appeared that the father and Clifford, had clear ideas about where they wanted to move the family. And so in doing my research, and after Bill McElroy helped me to find out what the cause of death, young Clifford died of typhoid fever. So how did that happen? I found a research paper that was on the typhoid epidemic of 1894 by a young man named Dan Capriati. I don't do Instagram and I don't do Twitter, but if any of you can find that young man, send him here to the History Center so that he can sign his research paper, if you don't have it, Jane. The research paper that he did on the typhoid epidemic in Montclair in 1894. The paper was he titled it, "The Morality of Carelessness, the Montclair Typhoid Epidemic of 1894," which began in February of that year at the George Gould Dairy in Verona. Dan persuasively argues the outbreak was avoidable. The Gould Dairy farmer's young son had taken sick. The case was diagnosed by Dr. John C. Love, who was on his way on vacation with his family, but got the word to the Montclair Health Department and asked them to take care of the problem and to stop the delivery of milk to Montclair. Long story short, Dr. Love's recommendation was not fully carried out when he left town. The Montclair Health Department and inspector got word to the New Jersey Dairy Commission, who visited the dairy but did not recommend a stop on delivery to Montclair. More than 50 deaths of individuals who were delivery customers of Gould's were the casualties. They were young and old, rich and poor, and Clifford Hooe was among the first swept away. In the article, it was said he was a daily consumer of milk from the Gould Dairy. He was buried on April 16, 1894, and at the height of several other deaths from typhoid fever within the same period. Capriati found that only local clergy condemned the senselessness of the spread of the disease. He found a transcript from a sermon delivered by Montclair's first Congregational Church, Reverend Amory Howe Bradford, who was a pretty famous name in the township at the time. The title of that sermon was "The Morality of Carelessness." In essence, in that sermon, Bradford declared, "A man who violates a sanitary law is no more excusable than one who deliberately aims a pistol at his neighbor's head and kills him." Pretty strong words. The tragedy was written about in the New York Times during the same week of Clifford's death. The article named him, but incorrectly spelling his name, and stated he was a part-time mail carrier. Not that he was a co-owner of a news store. The article stated he was a mail carrier, although he could have been, along with part of the delivery of papers, although at that point, I don't know that he was still delivering papers if they were running that store. A few months later, Alice, his sister, would become the first African-American to graduate from Montclair High School. And later that year, she was on her way to Howard University. It's important to mention the Montclair public school system at this point had gained national notoriety. Randall Spaulding had taken a group of students to an educational expo in Philadelphia where he demonstrated use of the then cutting-edge learning system called the Quincy method. He was an admirer of the educator who founded it, Francis Parker, then superintendent of schools in Quincy, Massachusetts, and perfected the method in Montclair. They won second place to a school in California for best educational approach. the school system has maintained such a reputation since then. 1894, I said the family is trying to keep calm and carry on. So Alice enters Howard University, and later on that year, the second co-founder, the brother William, is taken ill and dies of consumption. That was the common name in 1894. Today we call it, tuberculosis, right? So the family takes over the news dealer business with Rasher at the helm. Also, by this time, Sarah is helping out, that's the wife, and also the father is helping with the family business. So, two tremendous losses to the family, Alice away at college. So, this is Evangeline, and in 1895, she is 15 years old, and I just imagined that Evangeline couldn't take it anymore, and so she slipped away, and she married Justin Roger Fitzroy at 15. And at 15. In Bob Herbert's documentary, Against All Odds, A Fight for the Black Middle Class, he discusses, because going backwards, Justin Fitzroy for a time was a bookkeeper, and he was described, it might be important to understand how he was described in the census. He was a mulatto. His father was of English descent, and his mother was from Barbados. So here again, the population is very diverse. So in back to Bob Herbert's documentary, he discusses mail carrier job titles and what they meant in the African American community. Soon after Justin Roger married Evangeline, he did get a job and was appointed permanent mail carrier here in Montclair. Bob Herbert says, such a title afforded one a middle-class lifestyle. A part of this middle class, in essence, mimicked the white society. Further, he stated, for many blacks, the route to a better job was to own a business. His grandfather owned an upholstery shop during the Depression, and from looking at the documentary, it looked like it was down on Walnut Street. He further stated, in Montclair, there was not much in gainful employment to be had, but if you owned a business that was different. Bob Herbert is a Montclair native and a journalist. So, does this make the Hooe family now a part of the black middle class? And now that Justin Fitzroy is a mail carrier, are they a part of the black middle class now? Probably.
Yes.
Yeah, very much so, probably.
Tourists were around for a while.
Yeah.
That family was around for a long time.
Okay. So, no, this is not Charles. But, as you can imagine, doing this kind of research, I was distracted on a number of occasions. And I was distracted. Charles was a horse clipper. And we lost him for a number of years. He was not listed where I could find him and find out what he was doing. And when I finally found him, he was listed in the Montclair Business Directory as a horse clipper. And you can see both he and his brother, Rasher, this is 1908 Business Directory. So what was my curiosity? My curiosity was, what does a horse clipper do? Okay, and so I was looking for what kind of equipment they use. So this is the equipment they would have used. I found this on the internet on an antique site where they said this is what was used to groom the horse in the 1890s. Well, I found something similar to this in my house, and I was using it as an edger because it was still sharp. And it was very useful, and that's what I thought it was. Well, now, because there was a horseshoe over my door, and I left it there, I never moved it when I bought the house 20 years ago. And so I'm thinking that that edger, I have been looking for that edger for 2 weeks now. I don't know what I did with it. But at any rate, I want to get it to that eBay site. But this picture distracted me because this is a famous horse and his groomer. The famous horse is Man of War, and the groomer is Will Harbert. The story of these two, this horse made a lot of money for his owners, and this handler, this groomer here, also became very famous in the 40s. Least I digress. Sorry about that. Alice graduated in 1898 with a degree in classical studies, and she moved to Martinsville, Georgia to teach. So she was down there for a couple of years, and in Montclair, you see in 1900, the population has grown significantly, but there's a discrepancy here because in 1894, Whitmore is listing the African-American population at 1,600, but in the, I found the book that I used, the Montclair chapter of the New Jersey Society of the Sons of the American Revolution, and in that book they listed the African-American population at 1,344. So I didn't, go back to try to figure out the discrepancy. So Alice was called back home by her parents to help the family at the news store. And Charles Sr. now is about 53 years old, and he's continuing his work as a carpet layer. Remember, I told you after 7 years, he was no longer employed at the Trinity Presbyterian Church. Meanwhile, Charles Jr. and Rosher, the next oldest son, entered another Hooe business venture. So this is a picture on the historic database for Montclair, 1895 to 1900. So what you see here is how Montclair is rapidly changing. It's pretty obvious from this picture. We are moving away from an agrarian to an industrial society. And by this picture, the mode of transportation is also changing. So Dr. Samuel Watkins has a pretty lengthy description of how it is that he had to walk through cow pastures in order to get to the Lackawanna station, to get the train. So in looking at this particular picture in 1895, 1896, the Hooe brothers are looking at what other challenges they may be offered in the community for them as a business opportunity. And so you see in what I'm looking at here in the background is the horse and buggy, and in the foreground, you've got the bicycles, right? Okay, so in 1900, so the Hooe brothers, meaning Charles Jr. and Rosher, they start their own bicycle storage business, which makes sense, right? And the business is located right here, and this is called Spring Street. Here is the train station. And what's this little triangle here, folks? That's Crane Park. Yeah, that's Crane Park right now. So the Hooe brothers were always right in the middle of business opportunities here in the township. And on this street, the businesses that were listed here was a restaurant, there was a confectionery, there was a livery stable, which makes sense, right? There was a paint shop, and there was an insurance office. So the father would often be there by now to also assist his sons at their bicycle storage business. But the news store is also still open. So the family is stretched to the limits, right? So they've got a news business going, they've got a bicycle shop, they've got their home, and Charles Sr. is still doing the carpet laying. Right. So, and Grace, at this particular time, was the bookkeeper for the family business. So here's another picture, and I said, Mayor Freed, eat your heart out, remember? Because he was really pushing the bikes and more bicycle riding in Montclair, when, if you look at this, bicycle riding, this was a picture of a bicycle club, and this is also on the historic database for the Montclair Public Library. That's where I captured these pictures. And you see here that even though this is a horse-drawn carriage, here's the challenge to the Hooe brothers, right? That is a Rambler. And the car maker for the Rambler ultimately became AMC, American Motors Corporation. Okay. So this gentleman here is Herman Kohler, and he is said to have been the first automobile dealer in Montclair. So that poses a problem. Now, here's the next thing. The sisters were not to be outdone by their brothers. In 1906, the Hooe sisters, Alice and Grace, bought 415 Bloomfield Avenue, this building right here. And it became known as Hooe's Hall. And so when they bought the building, they already had a number of, they bought the building from Stephen and Minerva Dodd, which was the last name of a longtime family here in Montclair as well, the Dodds. And so they sold the building. When I looked at the deed, they sold the building to Alice and Grace for $1, but there was a clause in there. And so from my understanding, I'm thinking I was told that don't believe that the building only sold for $1, that there were other attachments to that deed, because the deed was quite extensive. Although I'm not a lawyer and I couldn't read it, with any clarity and understanding, but I did know that it meant that, $1 would not satisfy the purchase of this building. So who was in Hooe's Hall when they purchased the building in 1906? The business was, as early as they bought the building, I don't know how this happened, Alice was listed as a hairdresser when she came back. And she was listed as a hairdresser for a number of years. You can see there was a dry goods store there was a dentist there, and this is the Chinese couple that had a laundry, but they also were renting in that building. And so these, I'm thinking, at the time, 1906, are the residents in the building. 1908 to 1910, Maple Place, we're back there on their street. There's a shift in population. The only original owners of the homes that are remaining there, 1908 to 1910, would be the Hooes and the Paladinos. They're still there. But who moves here on this into the house? So McGurk sold his house. Remember, he was the Irishman. McGurk sold his house to Charles and Sarah's daughter and her husband, Eva and Justin Fitzroy. And so by then, I think they had maybe about 2 or 3 children. And next door to them was this house was owned by the Swedish machinist, and the house was sold to a Dr. Hayes Burnett. Now, Dr. Hayes Burnett was an African-American doctor, and he was born in Arkansas. The names of doctors that we hear most often in Montclair are who? The Thornhill, Bell, Douglas, and Kinney, right? But we never hear about Dr. Hayes Burnett. And Dr. Hayes Burnett also had a practice on Montague Place. So he's living there with his wife, Bertha, and the house next to them is rented. The Scottish janitor rented this house to an Alexander Bullock, who was a grocery store clerk. Now, the English house decorator was a smart guy because what he did was he chopped his house up into two, and he rented out to two different families. So
Are they African-American families?
they were listed as mulattoes. Both families were listed were listed as mulattoes. And of course, the Paladinos were still there. So, you know, the neighborhood, so Justin is a mulatto, this family is a mulatto, and Dr. Hayes Burnett was not listed as a mulatto. Okay, so now we're in Montclair, 1910 to 1920. The African-American population is migrating more often, and I really need to check this because I think it may have happened earlier. They're migrating from the islands, Virginia, and other parts of New Jersey and North Carolina. So the population here has grown significantly by 1910, and there are now 2,485 African Americans. And in 1920, we've got 4,000 African Americans. And all of this data was from both Dr. Samuel Watkins' book and research that Elizabeth Shepard had accumulated. So I call this the decade of grief and of joy for the Hooe family. And so around 1910, the Hooe Brothers news store closed, and I think it had something to do with the building of that Montclair Savings Bank. December 10, the young sister, Sadie Sarah, succumbs to tuberculosis. She had moved down to Lakewood, but her body was brought back here, and she was buried at Mount Hebron. But Alice was steady, holding steady, and she was very busy. In 1911, she was organizing the women at St. Mark's and Union Baptist to start the YWCA, and she was planning her wedding to Walter Foster. So her sister Grace was running a millinery shop at the time in the building. But 1913, Grace got married a John C. Sims. And 1914, you can imagine this would have been a year of grief for them. The father passed away of cerebral hemorrhage. In 1916, the husbands, Foster and Sims, became partners in Hooe's Hall. And 1970, their brother Rasher, remember Rasher Brothers and the bicycle storage? He passed away of heart disease. In 1917, their youngest brother, Philip, was drafted into World War I. I didn't follow up to find out if he actually served. In 1918, their mother passed away. So here are the homes of the YWCA that Alice was directly involved in the organization of, and showing here the first home of the Y and this building that we're in right now, the Crane House. These pictures, by the way, there are two very precious scrapbooks that I believe that Alice kept, and they are housed in the Montclair Public Library. And I think that it is so important for us as a community and the History Center that we grab those two scrapbooks, because I believe if you look at the handwriting that they were kept by Alice. And I think that these two scrapbooks need to be preserved, because I've used them on several occasions, got a lot of this information, and each time I did use them, even with the gloves, the pages are crumbling, and we're going to lose that information, and that information is too valuable for us not to have. So what was going on at Hooe's Hall? There were a lot of cultural activities, special YWCA programming activities that occurred there, and there were classical concerts there. In all of going through those two scrapbooks, I never saw the YWCA put on a jazz concert. Jazz was very vibrant in Newark at that time, but they were all classical music concerts, which was really quite interesting to me. But you could find jazz where? At the DLV? So 1920 to 1930, I'm keeping up very good with Alice, Grace, and Evangeline. Philip and Charles are in orange because I know Philip is up at Mount Hebron, but I got to catch Bill on a good day so that we can go back through all of those alphabets that he says he was not in the mood to do it on the day that I was there. And I don't blame him. I'm not blaming him. But Charles, I simply cannot find. I don't know where he went. He just disappeared. I do believe that he's around here someplace. And I've looked in New York. I've looked in Virginia. I've looked in a number of places for him. But I simply cannot find him. So 1930 to 1940, the Montclair population is steadily growing. The African American population is steadily growing, and during this period, there is some unrest that's going on in Montclair, and I couldn't get clarity on what that unrest was, but you know what we were dealing with nationally here, right? The Great Depression in between that period, right? We had just come out of World War I, right? And so from the Great Depression, Montclair suffered because you had all these New York businessmen here, and so the jobs that they were providing to people that were here were no longer available. So it caused a tremendous burden on the community. But from what I could read, Alice was steadily holding on, and there were people coming from other communities here in Montclair looking for jobs. And from what I could gather from the description that from her presentation to a Y assembly, she said that she didn't turn anybody away, but that she would give priority to those members of the Y when there were jobs available at the time, but that she would make referrals. And so what she was doing was maintaining contacts with the Newark Urban League and with Charles Bullock over at the YMCA for the Colored Men. And so they had like a little network going where they were helping each other out.
So that's about the population now, 39,000.
Is it? So we've maintained a
We
steady.
might be just over 40, but we're not. I think that's
Yeah.
pretty much our population.
Yeah.
38, just under 39.
Just under 39?
39.
Oh, okay. So this is information from Elizabeth Shepard's Evolution of a Community and the Story of Montclair, its people in peace and war times. And again, that's the sons of the American Revolution.
So Betty, when you say the African-American population, you give that number is subsumed though in the 39,000, right? Or no, is that additional?
Now, I'm not sure about that, and I will have to ask Elizabeth Shepard. Yeah, I would think that it is.
It's part of the 39.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're just saying.
Yeah.
The 6,000
Ju-
are part of the 42.
Yes, that's right. It's part of it, yeah.
Okay.
So we're looking at some organizations that were forming here in Montclair because there was a problem. And I don't know what the problem, I can't find the problem. The microfilm is not working at the library, and the Montclair Times is just crazy, and they don't have anything, and it's just regrettable.
I would imagine there's a lot of anti-lynching
I did find,
things going on during those years, and that was a big.
yeah, I did find, and I didn't go back to get it, there was a letter that Alice Hooe Foster and Charles Bullock wrote to Congress in support of an anti-lynching law that they were considering passing. And I think it was called the Dyer legislation. I don't know what it was at that time, but here in Montclair, something was going on. And the Altruist Society, which Annette Goodell was a part of, they were always sponsoring activities and trying to do good for all of the citizens in Montclair. So there was a committee that was formed called the Inter-Racial Committee, and that committee was formed to sponsor a number of activities to help bring about some understanding between the races. And so one of the things that they did was they invited a number of our very best, our meaning from the African American community. And they were often paired with those two major programs that the Y sponsored every year, which one was focused in April and the other one in November. And so they brought to Montclair speakers like W.B. Du Bois. Is there anybody who does not know who W.B. Du Bois is? And Reverend Adam Clayton Powell. This is not junior, this is Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr., right? And you see, this is the name of the committee, the Interracial Committee. They co-sponsored with the Y. They also brought writers in like County Cullen, who read poetry from his book, Copper Sun. And Aaron Douglas is the well-known Harlem Renaissance painter. He gave an art talk, as well as a James Porter. These are pictures of some of those people. Alan Locke is known, he was a philosopher and a professor at Howard University, and he's known as the father of the Harlem Renaissance. And he challenged the artists to paint, that's one of the things that he did, to paint black themes in their work. Aaron Douglas accepted that challenge, and that's why he's given that designation. And this lady here wrote a book called Unsung Heroes, and she was a part of the National Y. And this is Adam Clayton Powell Sr. and a picture of W.B. Du Bois. This is the painter I was telling you about, James Porter. He was also a professor and art historian at Howard University. He was brought to town as a part of that whole program, introducing Montclair to the best and the brightest of the African Americans, not just here in Montclair, but, you know, all throughout the country. And I just chose this painting as an example of something that he had done. It's called the Tempest of Niger. They're saying, during my day, we used to say Niger. Yeah, right, and they're calling it Niger now.
The French colonized it, didn't they?
Yeah, so at any rate, so this is Aaron Douglas, and this is typical of his style. Anytime you see a lot of his paintings, this is what you're going to see. Now, both of these gentlemen came to Montclair, and both of them exhibited their work, and their work was exhibited down at the Y, in that the building, the recreation building. So this is just an article that Alice, I think this is a note from Alice here. It says Herald, and I think this was the Newark Herald-Sun that where this announcement was letting the general public know that Aaron Douglas would be speaking in Montclair. I went and looked at some of County Cullen's poetry. Have any of you read any of his poetry? So I would recommend it highly. In talking to a very dear friend of mine, and I wanted to know about Walter and Alice's social life. I wanted her to tell me something about it, you know. Where did they go? Did they travel? What they eat? You know, all that kind of stuff, you know. And so she said to me, I said, so were you ever around them? She said, oh, no, they were a part of the 400s. I never heard of the 400s. Well, didn't I go to Google and find that the 400s was a term from the 1860s, the Gilded Age in New York, and was started as a result of Brooke Astor's guest list, right? She had a grand hall. She could only get 319 guests in that hall. But 400 invitations would go out, so they began to call it the 400s. And so that transcended over here. So then I asked Myrna Hinton the same question. And so Myrna smirked at me and she said, oh, so now you're asking me asked her cultural questions. And she said that you had to be living in the 4th Ward and the 6th District in order to be designated among the 400s in Montclair. And so not only were they known in Montclair, but East Orange knew who they were, and Newark knew who they were. And so the Montclair African American community did have its own cultural group that was very alive and very vibrant, contrary to what was written about them. So this is a picture, again, this is in that very precious scrapbook located at the Montclair Public Library. And this is an announcement of Alice's retirement from the YW. And this is Hortense here, and that's Alice. I'm sorry, the picture, this was the best I could do. You know, and this lady here is unidentified in any of the information that is written here about this announcement of them, and I guess Jane can tell you which room upstairs.
Dining room upstairs.
It's the what?
It's the dining room, the front, if you walk in the front door, it's on the left-hand side.
And that's where the office was. Very interesting. And so this has got to be my favorite picture of Alice. And this picture also is in those scrapbooks. It was the testimonial dinner given for her. And notice how she always, and this is something I found that was very unique with this, not unique, but it was endearing. They always carried their family name. She is Alice Hooe Foster. And so I thought that to me is a beautiful picture of her. I think that other picture of her maybe have been a teenage picture or a younger picture, but this one shows how she had aged and matured. That's why it was really hard for me to understand, you know, her tragedy and what she may have been suffering through. So this is the program from that dinner, and I think the woman who wrote Freedom's Child, I think her mother was maybe a moderator. What's it?
Her name was Carrie Allen McCrae.
Right. So.
Rosemary Allen? No.
No. Well, we'll come back. Now, here we are at Edwin Goodell, and please, I apologize for selecting such a menacing-looking picture of Ed Goodell. I didn't do that on purpose, but I looked at that picture and I said, wow, he looks really menacing. And so Ed Goodell was a part of the building of the financial institutions here in Montclair, just one of them. And he writes exhaustively about it in his book, Montclair, The Evolution of a Suburban Town. He tells you all about the meetings, what happened at the meetings, and you know how the banks were formed, and so on and so forth. And so I have mentioned his name in connection to the Hooe family on several occasions tonight, and also through several business dealings. And so in November of 1940, his son Philip issued a judgment to collect on a debt on Hooe's Hall. And the judgment said, and all the goods and attachments to be sold to collect on debt owed to the bank in the amount of $12,646. Remember, I said I didn't understand the actual sale and what all of the other stuff meant. Even though a dollar changed hands, that didn't mean that Stephen and Minerva gave Grace and Alice that building for $1. That's not what it meant at all. And I don't know what happened here, but in November of 1940, Walter is still living in this building. And remember I told you that Alice, it appeared to me, may be renting the room over on North Willow Street.
What was her cause of death in 1940?
I requested suicide. That's what they listed. And that's what is on the records at the Mount Hebron Cemetery. Suicide. So,
Found in the driveway of that building?
it found in the driveway, a neighbor discovered.
Would you shoot yourself or?
No, well, to be perfectly honest and to be transparent, Hortense did tell me that she jumped from the window. That's what Hortense said, but Hortense wasn't there. So I'm just, when I looked at that house and looked at the second floor, I'm thinking you may break a few ribs, couple of legs, but not to die. That's just my own conspiracy theory. So the judgment was issued November 1940. The building was sold to the Montclair Savings Bank in February, this November to February, for $100. So on her death, the community, there were several letters in the Montclair Times expressing sympathy, tremendous sympathy. And all of the comments that are written here, I just lifted some from some of the letters that I thought were particularly poignant and really spoke to who the family were in this town and what they tried to do. And, I still would like to know, what demons were chasing her and why she would do that at 65.
But it was December that she died, and November was the debt collection and all that.
Yep,
all
November she
property.
got, the judgment was levied. December she committed suicide. The building was sold for $100.
And it's overly simplistic to just say that was cause and effect,
But it's got, I think, now,
One of a bundle of things.
exactly. But I think that it had something to do with it, Could be betrayal. Could be betrayal because the family had a close relationship with them. So also in that year, Alice was, and this book is here at the History Center. It's called Who's Who in Colored America. This publisher, Thomas Yenzer, published 6 editions of this book, and this was the last one that was published. And Alice was in there as one of the who's who in America, not just Montclair, in America. But before the book went to publication, there is a page that lists a regret. There's a regret page that lists their sorrow that she died on such and such a date. So that's in the very beginning of the book. And so her sister Grace was buried by Martin's funeral service. She lived to be 90. Now, wouldn't you have liked to have been in a conversation with her? She would have had many stories to tell, and I'm thinking, she was a ward of the state when she died. And I can imagine that people that she was around thought maybe she was losing her marbles or something, but that she had many stories to tell. Now, the other interesting thing about Martin's funeral home, I'm just throwing this in here, is that was the home of Julius Pratt, who was he named Montclair and was one of the great leaders in the town. Right, Elizabeth? Okay, and so here we are surviving Grace, Alice's sister, Grace and, not Grace, I'm sorry, Justin and Evangeline. And they have 6 children, Justin and Evangeline. They were married forever. And so they moved to Newark in 1937, sold their house on Maple Place, and they moved to Barclay Street in Newark in 1937. This is the graduating class at Howard University from the dental school, and this is their son right there. That's Donald Clifford Fitzroy. And I emphasize Clifford because all of her children were named after someone in either his or her family. Her first daughter was named Grace, was named after her sister. She had another son that she named Charles Wesley Fitzroy. And she had a daughter that was named Sarah, named after her mother, Alice, named after Alice, Virginia, probably somebody on Justin's side, Fitzroy. So their daughter, this young man here is Donald Clifford Fitzroy II. That's his father here. And this is Donald Clifford Fitzroy III. Now, I have been in contact with this young man. He graduated from Glen Ridge High School. He's living in Seattle, Washington right now, and he's a middle school tech coordinator. And he didn't know anything at all about this side of his family. And so can you imagine how much joy it gave me being able to share this kind of information with him? And he's been delighted. One of the things he laughed and said was that he was separating the last name, Fitz, F-I-T-Z, and then capital R-O-Y, and he said it presented so many problems for him in banking and stuff. He said, boy, I'm glad to see that I can make it one name now, Fitzroy. So that was just one of the joys that I've gotten out of doing this research. And a friend of mine told me when I lived in Orange on Reynolds Terrace that this gentleman also lived there, and she said to me, Betty, you passed him many times, and I never knew that he lived in the same building that I did around the same time that I did. He worked for Woody's Funeral Home, and he died in 2000, and his dad died in 2002. So his dad had a dental practice in Newark for a while, and then he went back to Howard University to be a professor in the dental school. And so that's it. So that's my Southern expression. Montclair is just precious, I tell you, just precious.